Good afternoon, everyone, and welcome to today's ECA Member Exclusive Technical Tuesday webinar. Today, we're joined by ECA's Technical Manager, Chris Edwards, who's up on your screen now. Hi, Chris. Chris is going to give us an overview of some of the more important aspects of the Building Safety Act. Chris is going to cover, among other things, higher risk buildings, the golden thread, accountability, much more. But before I hand over to Chris to kick off today's webinar, you should see a question mark button on your screens now. Do please feel free to make use of that at any point throughout today's presentation, and we'll try to answer as many of your questions as we can at the end. Today's webinar is being recorded and will be available in the members area of the ECA website, as well as our YouTube channel, youtube.com/ECA live. In a couple of days from now. So I will be back for the Q&A, and until then, over to you, Chris.
Thank you, Omar. Good afternoon, everybody, and welcome to our today's webinar, where we're going to have a look at the Building Safety Act, as you can see. Now, the plan for the next hour is, as you can see on the screen here, what I intend to do is to cover off some high level and what I consider to be pertinent points really relating to the Building Safety Act, of course. Now, I just wanted to say before we even start really, the Building Safety Act is huge. It's far reaching, it covers many aspects of law and legislation. But I can only highlight, I've only got an hour really to cover off here. So what I've tried really hard to do is pick the pertinent points which I think may affect you the most and cover them off today. And of course, that includes, we're going to be looking at the legislation, we're going to be looking at the timelines of that legislation. Of course, we're going to be looking at the definition of higher risk buildings. We're going to be covering gateways, the role of the building safety regulator, as well as the golden thread, accountability and competence. We are going to just cover a few bullet points of other legislation too, and I thought it may be interesting right at the very end to cover off devolved areas of the UK. In other words, how the Building Safety Act affects Wales, Scotland and Northern Ireland. Okay. The initiator, as I'm sure you know, was this dreadful event in 2017. It's Grenfell Towers, of course. It's a 24-story building where, unfortunately, 72 people lost their lives. Now, as you can imagine, when this incident happened, there was a huge rollout of question asking. What happened? How can we improve things? How can we make this better so that it never happens again, effectively? Now, this was conducted by somebody called Dame Judith Hackett, and she released a report in 2018, as you can see there. Pretty quick. She was at the blocks pretty sharpish, and only took less than a year to release this report in 2018. Now, it was called Building a Safer Future, or Building a Safer Future rather, and her summary was, as you can see on the screen here. Now, it was pretty damning, as you can see here, and it covered some pertinent points. I mean, it's a huge report, but the pertinent points were, as you can see on the screen here. Ignorance with regard to a misunderstanding of regulation and guidance was one of the major factors, and we've seen the implications of the new safety net, as it were, later on. An indifference to quality and particularly safety, with a focus much more on speed and cost rather than quality. There was a huge lack of clarity on roles with regard to responsibilities and accountability. And inevitably, there was an inadequate regulatory oversight, and more importantly, I guess, enforcement when any of these situations above were identified. And she concluded, as you can see at the bottom there, the system is absolutely broken. This is why we've got what we've got. This can't go on. We need to put this right. And effectively, Dame Judith Hackett presented this report to the government, and the government accepted all of her findings, not just some, all. It was a really damning report presented to the government, and effectively they agreed. The consequence was effectively, look, the environment can't regulate itself. we need to do it now. We need to take responsibility. We need to regulate this to ensure that this never happens again. So the timelines moving on from that date. July 2020, the draft safety bill, building safety bill was announced. And this was passed through in pretty much record time, really. Only 2 years it took to pass through. It went through 17 stages of approval, as you can see there, and we won't dwell on those, but effectively it was passed really, really quickly. But there are some other timelines within that time period too, which I thought I would highlight today. 2021 saw the Gateway 1 be introduced by the Planning Act, actually. Gateway 1, which we'll have a look at shortly, is the pre-construction, it's the planning approval process, and that was introduced pretty quickly. And then 2022 saw some other really important changes. Now, you may note that some of these acts or legislation are highlighted on the screen in bold, and I've done that to try and draw attention to the fact of, whilst the Building Safety Act predominantly does focus on higher risk buildings, there are elements of this that cover all building types. And this is one such example here. We've got the Defective Premises Act was changed pretty heavily in 2022, and this affects all building types, of course. Now, there are some changes here. The extension of limitation periods by which any defective work could be recognised and acted upon. Now, this has also been changed to a degree too, because the Defective Premises Act historically is only referred to dwellings. Now, there is a suggestion that the Defective Premises Act also covers all aspects of buildings that contain dwellings. So for instance, we have a multi-story block that only has a couple of dwellings in them. The Defective Premises Act would cover the entire building, not just the dwellings. We've got the Building Act, significantly changed in 2022 with regard to Section 38 and the right to make a claim. This is again all to do with defective building work and civil liability. And following on from that, we have the approved document B. Now, the reason that I've highlighted this, and it's not in bold, is because this change that I'm referring to here was to do with new rules being introduced for external walls and balconies for new blocks of a certain height. So you could sort of say that they are higher risk buildings. But the two above, the Defective Premises and the Building Act, certainly do encompass all building work, not just high risk. Right, so this scenario started to gain momentum, and in 23 there were some more significant changes. And again, the same principle applies here. Those in bold affect all building work. So we've got the fire safety regulations came into force in January 23, and this is all to do with information being provided with regard to fire safety for buildings. Similarly, it's the same sort of scenario for the regulatory reform amendments that came into force in October. Now, the last one on the screen here is significant, and we will be covering this at a different section shortly. But this has a major impact on our environment anyway, and this is the Building Regulations Amendment 2023, specifically Part 2A, deals with competence and the duty holder regime. And as I say, we will be covering that later on, but it covers all building types, of course, not just higher risk. And then, of course, you've got the ones which do cover higher risk. All higher risk buildings needed to be registered from the 6th of April last year. The Building High Risk Regulations 23 introduced the golden thread, introduced the gateways, again, which we're going to be having a look at. And as I'm sure you know now, that building control inspectors are now called building control approvers, and they too had to be registered. These regulations came in 2023 and they had to be registered by the 1st of April 24. Now, so far this year, these are the changes, or the significant changes. With regard to the top one, there was a transitional period that you were allowed to, or a transitional avenue that you were allowed to go down with regard to if you'd already started work on a higher risk building. You didn't necessarily have to conform to the new regime if you met the requirements of this transitional period. That stopped on the 6th of April. Any work that was being applied for or being started after the 6th of April couldn't be subject to transitional changes. Anything after that date, and you'd get the full, more stringent building control regime rolled out. Now, the registration of building control approvers has been a bit problematic, as you can see on the third point here. They were supposed to register by the 6th of April this year, but there was a problem. There was a bit of a bottleneck, and it was a bit of a bottleneck, and it was established actually we're not going to have enough building control approvers by this date unless we extend this period by which they're allowed to register. And that's been done. They've been extended, or that period has been extended up until July this year. Now, this is starting to have a significant impact, as you can imagine. When I was putting these slides together, you was note the bottom point here. There's an article in Construction News that I noticed and I thought would be interesting just to share with you, really. As of April 2024, more than half of the Gateway 2 applications lack basic information and therefore have been rejected. We'll cover Gateway 2 and what that means going forward, but I just wish to share that with you. That's pretty much hot off the press. It's like, actually, look, we've got a problem. The industry isn't reacting as we would like them to. It's not presenting the information that we require at these gateways. Okay. And finally, before we move on, I just thought I'd share this point. This is information that is freely available and quite significant on the government website. It's entitled, as you can see here, Circular Letter, Changes to the Building Control Process. I hope you can see that. It was updated on the 28th of March, and it is up to date. And I've just snipped and shared some bits and pieces on here of the sections. But please, if this work interests you, or the legislation specifically interests you, then there is plenty of information, and the government are really trying hard to inform the industry with what's going on. So that's free. Obviously, it's on the government website, plenty of information. Please go on there if that interests you. Okay, so what is all this higher risk building, or what are higher risk buildings? Well, given that Grenfell was obviously the instigator for this reform, it stands to reason that a large focus of the Building Safety Act surrounds buildings of this type, although it's not limited to buildings of this type. But buildings of this type have now been referred to, they've been defined as HRBs, or higher risk buildings. And in England, that means buildings that are 18 meters in height, or at least 7 stories high, and contain at least 2 residential units. Slightly different in other parts of the country. Now, there is some detail about how you can count these stories, because as you can imagine, it's not always straightforward. If you're interested, there are prescribed methods for measuring height and counting stories in the higher risk buildings. As you can see on the screen there, that's the place to go. It's all free, of course. These regulations and the description and the measuring height process is all in there for you. But essentially, this is it. Generally speaking, 80 meters in height, so higher risk buildings. And if your building is a higher risk building, then the whole new regime rolls out. Now, it can get a little complex, but with regard to HRBs, or high risk buildings, During the construction phase, the definition of high-risk buildings is extended to include care homes and hospitals. The reason that I've highlighted that here is because it's only during the construction phase that these buildings, care homes and hospitals, are embraced by this new regime. Once the construction work is finished, they then pass out of the higher risk building regime into their normal process under the Care Quality Commission, etc. Incidentally, as you can see at the bottom, prisons, hotels and military barracks are also excluded from the definition, although there is a real hot topic of debate at the moment as to whether hotels should be included or not. Whether that will change in the future is difficult to say, but there is quite a hot topic in the industry at the moment, because there are those saying that actually hotels, they should be included. Anyway, at the moment, they're not, but care homes and hospitals are as part only for the construction phase. Now, it is only for the construction phase with regard to hospitals and care homes. When they are occupied, as I said just a couple of minutes before, they then fall out of this higher risk building regime. Unless, of course, additional work is going to be performed. If additional work is going to be performed, they then come back into this higher risk building regime and everything that entails. Now, there is definition of work that would meet the requirements of this higher regime, and it's, as you can see on the screen here, it's in Chapter 2, Regulation 12. There are two types of work, Category A and Category B work. Category A is pretty significant work. Category B work is not quite so significant. And there are some exceptions, as you can imagine. For instance, if you are updating sanitary ware, for instance, that probably wouldn't meet the requirements, even though it might have a significant scope. It probably wouldn't meet the requirements of Category A and B work. Anyway, that's the sort of gist. And with hospitals and care home, it's a bit you're in, you're out, you're in, you're out, and it can be a little bit complex. But for major construction work, they are in. They then fall outside unless they have refurb work that meets the requirements, and they come back into this elevated regime. Now we have something that's called the Building Safety Regulator. They're set up, as you can see on the screen there, under the HSE, and they're established with overall responsibility for building safety of all buildings. But they have special focus on higher risk buildings, as you can see, and their objective really is to promote competence and organisational capability. Okay, so with regard to higher risk buildings, we're going to have a look at the building control and specifically gateways, which you may or may not heard of. And what a gateway is, if you literally think of it as a gateway, it's a gateway with a hard stop. You approach the gateway and it is a hard stop process. So when you apply in for planning permission to build, let's say an HRB, for instance, you need to present this information in a certain way. So that's the gateway that you present your information at. Until you have presented your information and it has been scrutinized and deemed acceptable, you can't carry on until the next stage. Gateway 1 is, incidentally, there's plenty of information here you can see at the bottom. It's a planning portal, it's a government website, which gives you more information, exactly what sort of information is required. But there's a very heavy focus, as you can imagine, on fire safety here. How you are going to achieve fire safety for this point. Once that has been scrutinized, you're then free to pass through into the next section. But this is Gateway 1. Gateway 2 is the next stage. It's when you've gained planning permission, but construction work still hasn't started. Now, this is a much more significant process. This is a 12-week process for a new build premises, or 8 weeks for existing HRBs for refurbishment work or whatever. 12 weeks that the HSE have got, that the Building Safety Regulator has got to review all this work. And it's a rigorous inspection of building regulations come into full effect, with each design or each process of design and construction being analysed with regard to how can you prove that you're going to do this. So I've been told it's no longer acceptable to just reference, well, we're going to perform electrical work to BS 7671, for instance. They want to know how. They want to know who you're going to be using, what competence these people have, what equipment you're going to be installing, how you're going to be monitoring the situation, how you're going to be managing any change, if there is change likely, that sort of thing. It's quite significant, and they do have 12 weeks. But once you have been approved, after this stage and you pass through Gateway 2, then construction can start. So construction goes ahead, assuming there are no changes, it's all fine. They will be coming along and be doing site visits, and this is the HSE, of course, during the construction. But assuming that all goes according to plan, you've now finished the construction. There's one final gateway to go through before the building can be occupied. And this is, of course, Gateway 3, whereby you need then to demonstrate, this is what we said at Gateway 2, this is how we've completed the work, this is how we are demonstrating that we are doing what we've said we've done. And again, this is a further 8-week process before the building can be occupied. Once you've met the requirements here, you get a completion certificate and the building can then be occupied. Now, this has recently come down. The original timeframe for this was 12 weeks. Now, industry complained, quite rightly too, really, saying 12 weeks is too long. We can't have a 12-week process for Gateway 2 and a 12-week process for Gateway 3. That's unrealistic. So HSE have responded by saying, okay, we're going to make it 8. That's probably not as short as we would like, but anyway, it's some progress. Now, incidentally, this is after completion of work, and this is quite an important aspect here, because there was some sort of confusion about what completion of work meant, and we're now reliably informed that completion of work means completion of the notifiable building work. It doesn't include snagging, so you can continue to perform snagging while this Gateway 3 work or inspection is going ahead, as long as you've completed the notifiable work. That's what we're being reliably informed. So that's gateways or Gateway 3. Now, moving on to the golden thread. The golden thread is pretty easy to understand, really. In a nutshell, all it means is information is available, because of course one of the aspects that the Hackett report identified right at the very beginning was there was no communication, there was ignorance with regard to what standards we should be installing to, and communication was one of those key elements. The golden thread is now a legal requirement, particularly for HRBs, well, only a legal requirement for higher risk buildings. And what it does, there are legal duties now imposed on the duty holders to create, obtain and store, as well as share the information. That is a really important aspect, because it was identified in the Hackett report that there were sometimes cases of siloing information, jealously guarding the information, not sharing it with those who needed to know. And the poor man, at the end of the chain, or lady, was being forced to install without all the information. And sometimes there were problems for that. So the purpose of the golden thread is to have the right information in order to understand the building, and the steps needed to keep both the building and the people obviously living in it safe at all times. Now, the important thing that we need to understand is the golden thread passes through all aspects of the building history or lifespan, as it were. So it covers, and it's applicable, and it starts rolling out from the planning stage, because that's when you have the concept, don't you? All the information is sort of laid in stone or cast in stone there, really. So it includes the planning, it includes the construction or the pre-construction, it includes the construction, completion, and the occupation. So this file, this information can get bigger and bigger over time. And importantly, it carries on while the building is completed and occupied, and includes any changes to that building during the occupation too. And it's a bit like a baton in a relay race. The responsibility for this does pass from person to person throughout that chain. And when the building is completed, of course, it passes to the accountable person for that building. But that's essentially what the golden thread is. It is information. It is a legal requirement. Absolutely, be no doubt about that. There's plenty of information about what is required, and if you are interested, that's where you find the information, Part 4, Section 31 of the Building High Risk Building Procedures Regulations 2023. There are lines and lines of the detail that should be included in there. I didn't want to share that with you today, it's just too much. But that's where you find the information, and that's what the golden thread is. Now we're going to have a look at this section in a little bit more detail, because this has a bit of an impact on us, as you can imagine. This is significant. This covers all building types. It's not just high risk buildings, although this does, of course, cover them too. Now, this is the Building Regulations 2023, Amendment 2023, and it sets out a framework which identifies duty holders involved in the whole process, involved in the procurement, involved in the design, and the undertaking of building work. And it imposes duties on all of them. So it's the client, the principal contractor, the principal designer, general contractors, general designers. Everybody's there. They're the sections, although there are quite a few overlapping areas too. But if you're interested and these apply to you, please just take a note of that. That's where you can find the detail. Now, there are common duties for all, as you can imagine. They're quite generic, I guess, as they would be. But it tells us this: building work must be planned, managed, and monitored to ensure compliance with building regulations. Now, don't underestimate these words. I know these can be a little bit generic here, but they must be planned. It's no good just saying, yeah, I planned it. How did you plan it? What building regulations were applying? Who was doing the work? What qualifications did they have? This is all the information that they're going to need, or that the building inspector is going to need. The design must be adhered to and is to meet all relevant regulations, and it is the designer's responsibility to ensure that no more shrugging shoulders. I didn't know, I've always done it this way. That's not going to wash anymore. Everyone has the responsibility to share information, make information available when requested, and to support other duty holders in achieving compliance. I've worked in building for many years myself. I know what it's like. You know, you can be the little man at the end of the chain doing the role, and sometimes it's really difficult to get the information that you need. That's no longer good enough. That's no longer an excuse. If you request the information, it needs to be shared with you, and it's a responsibility. It's a legal requirement to do that. Interestingly, well, I found it interestingly, and I just wish to share that with you now. The language in this act, or in these regulations for accountability, is much stronger now. It's been hardened. It's not, you know, we used to be used to things like, well, it's best endeavors, isn't it? Take reasonable steps. It's that sort of language which is very familiar to us. Not any longer. These are quite significant now. It's like, you've got to ensure the building work that you carry out is compliant with the relevant requirements. And duty holders need to demonstrate this, as we've said on the last slide. Now, the Building Safety Act is a bit of an enabling act in many respects, and it's got, as I mentioned right at the very beginning, it's got far-reaching tentacles, as it were. And the government, when they were putting this together, they've done a pretty good job. They've been a bit sneaky in some respects, because they've just left the door open for them to change things as and when they want to. Not in the act as such, because that would take too long, but just to give them something in an act that enables something at a later date that is much easier to change, like building regulations, for instance, Part P or whatever it might be. So it's actually the Building Safety Act, Part 3, Section 35, that creates powers to regulate competence of any appointed person. And it says this, it says building regulations may, in relation to any work, impose competence requirements on anybody, effectively. And competence is anything to do with skills, knowledge, experience, and behaviours of an individual. Interestingly, behaviours, and I will come on to that in a second. It's not just individuals that they mention. Also, they also mention companies if the responsibility refers to them too, and their duties with regard to competence. Okay, so the general compliance for all, any person, as we've just seen, carrying out building work must have, where the person is an individual, skills, knowledge, experience, and behaviours. Where the person is not an individual, the organisational capability to carry out building work in accordance with all requirements. Now, the organisational capability, what that means is that you need to be able to demonstrate that you have the competence requirements to do the work. It's not necessarily saying that you can't use apprentices in their first year just for argument's sake, because they may not be deemed competent. But you need to have in place the supervision aspects of this to ensure that if you are employing people like that who need additional supervision, you are putting those processes in place with people who are competent, who do meet those requirements. That's the intent here. It's not saying that everybody needs that. Bang, you've got to have this, that. It's saying that your team needs to, and somebody needs to take overall responsibility for that. And then again, just to highlight, this is a building regulation. This is all work. It's not just high risk buildings, of course. Now, this is competence as opposed to duty holder responsibilities that we sort of looked at before. Now, I've highlighted here this document here, which is called Flex 8670. Sorry. Now, I'm only highlighting it really because it may be a source of useful information. I just wish to point out that it is only a code of practice and it is for competence frameworks. But if you have a look through it, it may help you understand and it may help you achieve overall competence requirements. And, you know, it's been put together by an awful lot of industry experts with their input too. Please, it's free to download. It's available, and I'm just sharing it because I thought it may be helpful. But anyway, there are competence requirements as well as duty holder responsibilities for all of us in every aspect of work we do. Now, I touched on earlier behaviours, and this is again something I found really interesting when I was sort of going through this for the purposes of the slide, because I've not seen this in law before, other than, you know, you've got to comply with building regulations. But they've gone a step further here in chapter 5 with regard to necessary behaviours. And it tells us this: necessary behaviours include compliance with relevant requirements. Okay, that's the sort of language we're used to. But including refusing to carry out work if you think the work is not compliant, or if you think that any design work to which the building relates cannot be carried out in compliance with relevant requirements. It is your duty to refuse to carry out the work if you suspect you're doing something that doesn't comply. I've not seen that before. And that's a new one. And that is a competence requirement under statutory regulations. It tells us it is your duty. If you think somebody's asking you to do something and doesn't look right, or to bodge it, or whatever your interpretation of that might be, it is your duty under the law to stand back and report it and refuse to carry it out. Similarly, it's extended as well. For the purposes of this part, the necessary behaviours include, and there we are again, cooperation with other persons in relation to work, in relation to supplying the information, to helping them with the information, to helping them carry out their work if need be. Not to literally holding a ladder, I'm not talking about that type of work, but it's cooperation with other persons with regard to their area of duty holder responsibility. And this last one, point C, refusing to carry out work which is beyond your skills, knowledge or experience. So it's time for us to be honest with ourselves, you know, and you see that particularly our industry is changing all the time, isn't it? We've got net zero coming in, we've got new technology coming out all the time, and we're not all experts on this. If you're not, and you're pushing your comfort zones, or you're stepping outside your comfort zones to the point where you don't think you now have the skills or the knowledge or experience to install that to the building regulations or safety, it is your duty to refuse to carry out that work. Okay. Now, this isn't directly related to the law, but I just thought I'd mention it anyway, and it's a sort of a little bit of a side attack, really. But this is, as I'm sure most of you are aware, this is to do with the Electrotechnical assessment specification, which deals with competence in our industry, and it has done for ages. The specification sets out the minimum requirements to be met by an enterprise in order to be recognised by a certification scheme or a registration body. And as you can see here, it's the basis really, isn't it? We all know it's the basis for mandatory technical competencies for competent person schemes. Now, there have been some changes to this. Brought about, by and large, the industry is trying to be self-regulated in many ways. I'm talking about just the electrical industry here. We've recognised for years that there are some aspects, or there are some problems with people coming into the industry not having the competence. We know when Part P first came out, there were electricians who attended a 7-day course or whatever, and they were masquerading as fully competent electricians, etc., etc. So the industry has been trying to close the door on this. But don't underestimate the influence of the Building Safety Act on this too. It's all part of the same thing. And I just sort of highlight this and indicate some likely changes to the EAS as we go forward. There is a new appendix, a relatively new appendix for guidance for demonstrating competence of employed persons. And this year, we are likely to see a fairly significant overhaul of the minimum technical competence section for all people, not just QSs. And I just thought I'd share that with you. It's the sort of thing going hand in hand, really, of the legislation that's behind this. Okay. With regard to other legislation, and now the Building Safety Act, of course, covers and has far-reaching aspects, as we've already mentioned. One significant one is the Building Regulations 2010. It's section 38, and this is all to do with the provision of fire safety information. It's been significantly reinforced and requires both the contractor and the client to confirm the information has been provided. This is fire safety information that needs to go to the responsible person at the completion of the project or where the building or extension is first occupied. It's the responsibility to ensure that information is being passed over, because this again comes back to the Hackett reports. This was identified again that even though this sort of stuff was loosely has always been about, it wasn't happening. It just wasn't being provided. It's like, well, I've never done that type thing. And that was very much the sort of industry attitude. There are multiple examples now in law where this is now being hardened. This whole situation has been hardened. The detail, the information is needed, or part of the golden thread, particularly with high-risk buildings. This covers all buildings, of course. And the Building Act 1984, been around for a long, long time, but Section 35 was again significantly changed. This is the penalty for the breach of building regulations. So if a builder or work was being performed that was considered to be in breach of the building regulations that may cause damage or danger, then we've got the removal altogether of the timeline for prosecutions, and fines increased, as you can see. And this is, again, this is the other aspect, I suppose, isn't it? I mean, we don't like to talk about it, but you know, it's right at the beginning where the Hackett report identifies, well, what's the industry doing about it? There's no follow-up, there's no backup. If anything does go wrong, who's policing this? What's the law that says we can't do this anymore? So it's hardening the law, hardening the act, and providing the building safety regulator to monitor this situation. There was also, with regard to the Building Act still, section 36 too. And this is all to do with the removal of non-compliant work and the timeline to do with this. So if work was put in and it wasn't subject to building regulations, or it didn't meet building regulations, Section 36 now covers the fact of, look, actually, we may need to take this out, we may need to put this right, and the time limit for that period now has gone up to 10 years. Now, the next point is pretty significant. This is all to do with building liability orders. It was actually the Building Safety Act, Part 5, got this ball rolling. But as with the Act itself, it enables other parts of legislation that are normally used to reinforce these points. So it's the Defective Premises Act and Section 38 of the Building Act now extend liability to associated body corporates, such as sister or parent companies. Now, this is all to do with if there's a building safety risk, of course. Developers and contractors and consultants that are or have ever been part of a group of companies should be aware of this, because the building liability order extends liability to parent and sister companies who may find themselves liable, even where a company has been dissolved. Now, this is the important thing, because it was also recognized historically there was a pattern for some that a company would spring up, perform some work, and then be dissolved. And then if you wish to then pursue that company legally, it was very difficult because they've been dissolved. They no longer exist. It was a limited company, limited liability. But now we've got these building liability orders that gives the power to extend liability into other areas. So if the company has been dissolved, but a parent company has sprung up or a sister company has sprung up, liability can be extended into that company to stop this protection, I guess, for some that has previously existed. That can be quite a big thing for some. And then, of course, we've got the general product safety requirement. This was set up for in Schedule 11 of the Building Safety Act, sets up a statutory framework that extends all construction products to all construction products, and not simply those used in high-risk buildings, of course. In other words, they've got to be fit for purpose. The products that you're using have to have a British standard or applicable. They need to be fit for purpose. That is now a requirement. That does go directly back to the Building Safety Act, Schedule 11, as well as other items of law too. Now, that has been a little slow being rolled out, but there is always Schedule 11 of the Building Safety Act to which anybody can refer if they suspect that a product has been used that is not fit for purpose, while the product safety register gets rolled out. Okay. Now, the building safety or the high risk building requirement also extends to building and occupation. Now, I don't wish to highlight this too much, only just to quickly cover it off, because this really is all to do with what happens to a building when it's occupied. And it's just to say, just to share really, look, it's still a high risk building. It's still under the remit or the review and the scrutiny, as it were, of the HSE. But it's just that the baton, the responsible baton, gets passed, as I mentioned before, to somebody now known as the principal accountable person, who needs to monitor the golden thread, to provide all that information, to ensure, unlike Grenfell, of course, that, you know, as work carries on, it wasn't compliant and all that sort of thing. It passes the baton over to the principal accountable person when a building is occupied. Just to share that with you. Really. Okay. Everything that we've spoken about so far is predominantly to do with England. Now, I just thought it may be useful if we very quickly cover off, and I'm quite aware of the time, if we very quickly cover off some devolved areas. So I won't highlight these in too much detail, other than just to quickly go through these. Wales, first, is slightly different, but by and large, it is rolling out the Building Safety Act and the recommendations in the Hackett report, albeit at a slightly delayed rate. Now, this is nothing to do with the fact that I'm knocking Wales at all. It's just to do with really the risk, I guess, to a degree, because just for some context here, again, when I was putting these slides together, the most up-to-date information I could find was taken from the Audit Wales information conducted in March 2023. And at that point, there were 173 high-rise residential buildings listed in Wales. 171, sorry. In England, at the same time, there were approximately 11,000. So you can see the difference, and possibly one of the reasons why Wales is saying, okay, we get it. It could be an issue for us, but we don't need to react in quite such an urgent fashion as England because of those reasons. But by and large, they are. There's no building safety regulator at the moment, but by and large, they are rolling out a very, very similar process. And a lot of the legislation that we've covered today is actually applicable in Wales too. You can see the points on the slide there. I'm not going to cover all of them, but again, just to say that it is very, very similar. Their timelines are slightly extended from ours, but by and large, they've adopted most of the processes, which is good. Scotland, as you can imagine, a little bit different, and Scotland, again, very similar reasons to Wales. In some respects. In other respects, Scotland has a very different building regime, building regulations, monitoring system to England. And by and large, it's considered to be fairly robust. Having said that, they have looked at the Act and they have made some changes in respect of hardening up any loopholes that the Building Safety Act has identified. So they too are making some slight changes, but nothing near like England has and nothing near like Wales has. Significantly, there's a new bill that is currently at stage 2 of 4, so it's halfway through being passed, all to do with cladding, of course, and the bullet points are down on the screen there. But they've recognised that actually, yeah, we potentially got some cladding issues too. We need to make sure we address that, and their definition of high-risk buildings, or the type of buildings that this bill encompasses, are slightly smaller than in England, but effectively they are plugging the gaps too. Yeah, the ministerial working group is set up to look at this. They've had a consultation period, and the consultation period closed at the beginning of this year. There are proposals being put forward, and they are contemplating where to go with this information as we speak. So they are making changes to Northern Ireland. Yeah, Northern Ireland are a little bit behind. Apparently they have 280 higher risk buildings or thereabouts. They are rolling out a similar sort of process, but again, it's a little different in Northern Ireland, but they are following in the same sort of lines. There are 9 key areas identified that pretty much align with the Hackett review after they were commissioned an expert panel, of course, to review the situation. They pretty much made the same conclusion as the Hackett review. So they're looking, what do we do with this information now? How are we going to roll it out? Again, as you can see there, they've got a slight different definition of high risk buildings. That's up to them. It's their area, as it were. And they're looking at now how to implement the recommendations. Expected, how they're going to do that, and the roadmap of how they're going to do that is expected in 2024. Okay, just to quickly summarize there, and I'm sorry, gents, if we went through this a little quickly, but I'm well aware of the time here at the moment. So just to summarize, Building Safety Act applicable to England, definitely, very much so in Wales, somewhat in Scotland, and lesser extent, even less at the moment in Northern Ireland. There is a specific focus on building safety and higher risk buildings in particular, but it's not limited to this work entirely. There is a new culture, significantly stricter culture for building control and particularly for higher risk buildings. Introduces new accountability for all of us, ownership, golden thread, responsibility, competence requirements for all of us. Golden thread, of course, is just for high risk buildings. These measures are considered to be an important step to building a safer future for all of us. And that is it. I'm sorry to have taken up slightly, we went slightly over there, but anyway, that's the Building Safety Act in a nutshell, hopefully. And if you've got any queries, I'll hand over now to Omar.
Thank you very much, Chris. I can see a couple of questions here. I've tried forwarding them on to you. Let me know if you can see them in your control panel there. If not, I'm happy to read them out.
Let me see. Oh goodness, it's such a weeny little box, isn't it?
It is, yeah.
Okay, so where are we? In an existing commercial building?
That's it, yeah.
What size of project would need this to be implemented? Would it include maintenance visits? Would it include refurbishment? Okay.
And if you could kind of sum up the question just for the recording.
Yes, no, of course. Right, okay, yeah. Sorry, you can't see. Okay, in an existing commercial building with a few penthouse apartments on the roof, 20 million plus, I'm assuming that's cost. What size of project would need this to be implemented? Would it include maintenance visits? Okay, I think this is getting to the scope of work. Now, the building itself would be classified as a higher risk building. Presumably, it does depend on how high it is, how many stories it has, and what type of who lives there. Effectively, you do need to have some sort of dwellings in that building, but it's the building itself. Because, for instance, if you were doing work just in the basement, for argument's sake, or on the first floor, if you were doing work in the gym, for instance, it's not necessarily the work that you're doing in there. The whole building is classified as a higher risk building, therefore the whole work type would need to comply to the higher risk building work. But if you're in any doubt, there is types of work, if it's just refurbishment work or improvement work or updating work, and that would potentially be category A or category B work, as identified in the regulations 2023. But if you need any more information on that, and I'm aware that I'm trying very hard not to skip over it, but if you need any more information on that, I can provide that outside this. If you just want to contact us, that's no problem at all.
Okay, thank you, Chris.
Can an unqualified person do electrical work maintenance in a building with 7 floors? Okay, well, this is not necessarily anything to do with the Building Safety Act, isn't it? This is all to do with risk. But don't forget the Competence now is and the competence requirements and the duty holder requirements cover all building types, not just high risk. So irrespective of how many floors it has, we have the requirement to make sure that that building is, or the work is safe. So that means, as per the definition on the HSC website for competence, and I'm just trying to think of it off the top of my head, but it covers experience, qualifications, all that sort of thing. The HSC competence requirement or definition is quite clear, as is the requirement for us now, and it's all to do with safety. If that person isn't able, hasn't the sufficient skills, knowledge and ability to do the work, then the answer is no. And the ability to recognize the danger that working on that system may entail either for himself or for other people, and be aware of the building regulations, the requirements of 7671, and be able to interpret them and install those safely, then as per the law, are they allowed to? No, not unless somebody is supervising them and taking responsibility for them who has all those competence requirements. I hope that answers your question. What is the definition of residential? Workplace that provides sleeping facilities. Ooh, that is a really good point. Now, I found that the other day and I can't remember for the life of me where I found that, because there is some debate about what is the definition of residential. And I believe it is provide sleeping accommodation. Yeah, you're quite right. Yes, I may need to come back to you on that, because I'm just for the life of me trying to think of where that is, and the specific place escapes me. But as far as I'm aware, it is residential would be like a dwelling where somebody would normally live and sleep. Yes. But if you after a definitive on that, that's absolutely no problem. Leave your details and I will get back to you. No problem at all with definitive on that.
Thanks for that, Chris. And just to add to that, in terms of follow-up on the questions we've had today, extra information, links to the information that Chris mentioned in his presentation, all of that will be included, along with contact details for the ECA technical team. All that will be included in the description on the replay on the video on YouTube. That will be available within the next couple of days. That will also be available just under the video when it appears on the ECA website. So you'll have to be an ECA member to log on and view the replay of today's session. That will also include all the replays of previous Technical Tuesdays webinars. Like I said, they are exclusively for ECA members. In terms of other bits of content we have on the YouTube channel that are publicly available, we have the ECA Learning Zone series, a slightly different series of webinars that we do with our commercial associates. So do please check those out as well. And in terms of specific follow-up, we'll do that after this call. I have the details, Chris, of the people who asked those questions, so we can do some individual follow-up there. No problem.
Perfect.
Okay, we will wrap up there. On to lunch, I think, for most of us. So thank you very much again, everyone, for joining us, and thank you, Chris, for a great presentation.
Thank you.
Okay, take care, everyone.
Have a good afternoon.